So what's up? My name's Skylar. I'm a sophomore from New Jersey. So the early Americas, continuities after 1200 CE, and it's hosted by me. So before we begin, I just want to tell you guys, follow Thinkfiveable on Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. I found them through YouTube, and they really helped me to understand the topics a lot better. It was really great. They have their Instagram. They've got some high quality memes. Also, you guys can follow me on Instagram or Twitter. So if you have any questions afterward, just feel free to DM me. I wanted to go through a quick sourcing analysis. So for those of you who don't know, sourcing analysis is basically you're looking for a specific topic within a paragraph of text, or it could be a picture. This is a prime example of something you could find on your DBQ. And just a little bit of background information about this. This is talking about Tenochtitlan, which was basically the center of Aztec society. And when the Spanish came, they actually destroyed it. It was considered to be a pretty large loss of this architectural, beauty. Anyway, we want to look for in this text sort of some examples of continuity and change. So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to read through it, and just leave in the chat some ideas that you have about how this shows some continuity in South American society. Okay, that's fine. I can go over some myself. So one thing that we can see here is this intermingling of religion and architecture. So they talk heavily about this temple that's right in the middle of the Lake Texcoco. Can't say that right. And it's a religious site. So this here shows us that, in the past there have been these instances of religion and architecture blending, and it's still going on here. In addition, we see the theme of human sacrifice. Now, this was a huge thing in a lot of these pre-Columbian American societies, and even in Europe and Asia, we've seen this. But specifically in this text, we can see at the bottom, the second to last line, they mention the blood of a number of prisoners of war. So it wasn't just the Aztecs that did this human sacrifice. It was also the Mayans, the Inca, many North American societies sometimes participated in this. So that's an example of a continuity between a lot of these groups. But we also have an example of a change that later ends up becoming a pattern the further we go into history. And this is just this European discovery and European contact of the American societies. You really didn't see the Europeans coming over before the 1200s and interacting with these other groups. So that's just a really good example of it. Let's keep going. So in this stream, we're going to be defining continuity, and then we're going to have a little discussion about the Americas before the 1200s. And we're going to specifically talk about five societies, the Olmec, Chavin, Aztec, Inca, Maya, and Cahokia. The printer's in here, and she deems it necessary to use the printer right now. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, we can go over it then. Okay, so the first question is, what are continuities? I mean, I've been asking you this question constantly, and who really knows what it is? So continuities are the elements of a society that remain the same over a given amount of time. So what are some examples of continuities that you can think of? Leave your answers in the chat. Okay, so Lucy said advertising. That is a great one. We see advertising on TV all the time. It doesn't matter when. It's there always. I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Zian. We see Confucianism in East Asia. And that is a really good point. Across all of these different time periods, you see Confucianism sort of remaining as this permanent fixture of society. Like even today, it remains a huge part of Chinese culture. In addition, we have religion. That's a great answer too. It's a little more broad than what AP World looks for specifically, but yeah, that's true. And so we can think of if we want guidance with this when we're analyzing, you should really look for spice tea. And this sort of is representative of all of your historical themes. So we have social ideas, political interactions with the environment, cultural, economic, and technological. If you think of any more, just feel free to leave them in the comments. So why are continuities important? Oh, trade, yeah, great answer. Just as a little disclaimer, the College Board really likes to be specific in an essay about like continuities. So just saying like religion or trade, it's true, but it should be more specific. Like we have caste system in India. That is another A+ example. It still remains today. It remained 1,000 years ago. So the continuities are important because it gives you a more in-depth knowledge of history, and it can help prepare you for the LEQ. If you don't know what that is, that's the long essay question. And basically you have 3 options and you have to write an essay based off one of those 3 options. So we're going to talk about the Americas before 1200 CE. And specifically, we're going to talk about civilizations up to 600. So the first one is the Mayans. So here we see, the Mayans were known for their decentralized system. Because a lot of these groups, you see this even in like the Afro-Eurasia, this decentralized system is very common. You have all these different city-states, all these different groups, based around one larger city that are sort of interacting with each other. They also use the tributary system. Very good job. This city-state system is kept in check by the tribute system. So basically, you would have one larger city-state that sort of governs over everyone else. And they have all these smaller city-states, these tributary states, who are paying them money. Or not necessarily money, they could also be goods. We'll see that in the Incas. So the Maya, they invented a numerical system, and it's remarkably similar to the one we have today. Another fun little fact about them is that they actually developed the concept of zero. Also, the Gupta did that in India. However, they actually developed it like the same time. They also had a lot of large cities. So we can see 2 examples, Tikal and Teotihuacan. Quick question. Does anyone know what Teotihuacan later became known as? It's a pretty big city today still. That's fine. Teotihuacan later became known as Mexico City. It's still there today. But in between being Teotihuacan and Mexico City, it was I am going to pronounce this, sorry, Tenochtitlan. And that was basically the city that we talked about in our first example. Okay, so Teotihuacan is actually more of a multinational city because you have all these different early groups that are sort of influencing it. However, the Mayans had the most influence, and that's why I'm categorizing them under this. You also see this idea of divine rulers in the Mayan religion. The rulers were seen as descended from the gods. They also had interregional trade. So like a lot of the early groups, even in Afro-Eurasia, they didn't really have these large continent-spanning trade routes for another few hundred years. They practiced human sacrifice. Also, they valued conquering, which is pretty common back in the time. And now we're going to talk about the Olmecs. So when we think Olmecs, what's the first thing that pops into our minds? Okay, well, for me at least, the first thing that I think of is heads. Yeah, the giant basalt heads. The Olmecs, they sort of coexisted, but yes, they did come before. So they were really well known for these large stone heads, and these are a great example of their religion and daily life. Because it's widely believed that the heads sort of had some sort of spiritual meaning to them. Like the Mayans, they sort of had this interregional trade. And then they also had villages and cities. So the interesting thing about the Olmecs is that a lot of like the rich people, the rich and powerful, they didn't necessarily live in these larger cities. They lived in the villages outside of the cities. And then we have the Chavin. I don't know how you say that. I am very sorry. Let me just get the rest of that in there. Okay, so the Chavin were a religious hierarchy. So, this is very common. It's like a monarchy, basically. You have the ruler, you have all the people below them. But like it was almost as if they were descended from the gods, much like the Mayans. And their city, like the main city in the Chavin civilization, it was based around this large temple, which, like a theocracy. I mean, technically, it was just that religion was really intertwined with the culture there. I mean, but this is almost every early civilization. In addition, they had these really high elevations, so they didn't have as much, no problem. They didn't have as many different crops that they could grow. So they were very reliant on potatoes and maize. And if you don't know, maize is basically corn. They had these really large buildings, just monumental architecture, and they had no written language. Now, this is surprisingly common in the Americas for the time because most of it was spoken. You know, they didn't have to record the languages. So now we're going to do a little fast forward, and we're going to talk about some of the civilizations after 1200 CE. So how much do we think we know about the Aztecs? Right the first thing that comes to your mind when you think Aztecs. Pyramids. Yeah, that's fair. Human sacrifice. That's also very fair. Yeah, so for a lot of people, the first thing is human sacrifice. And they did that a lot. I can't really say much about it. It was important for their religion. And they mostly used prisoners of war. Because in Aztec society, you really had to keep conquering because, like all the other ones we've talked about, it's this city-state tribute system. So the more prisoners of war you get, the more powerful you become. And by sacrificing them, that sort of goes along with their religious beliefs. Anyway, so they had this triple alliance, basically, and it was based around Lake Texcoco. So if you look at the map that I included at the bottom, you'll see in the top right corner that there's sort of like this lake. And you can see like the three major societies. So there was Tenochtitlan, formerly known as Teotihuacan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. I said 0 of those right. And they, like all these other societies, had interregional trade. They also had huge cities. And when I say huge cities, I'm imagining Tenochtitlan. I mean, it was a floating city. They built it on top of the lake, using like these large buildups of like organic matter and rock. It's really amazing. They also religion had a really huge role in their daily life. You know, you had a lot of the buildings that were in Tenochtitlan, they were all these temples. And they also emerged in the 1200s. So that is a lot of these pre-Columbian societies that we imagine. We always picture them as being like, oh, this is an ancient society. They've been around since 8,000 BCE, but really the Aztecs, they took a while to sort of unify. Yeah. And now we're going to discuss the Inca. So the Inca are actually in the same territory as the Chavin, and the Chavin are often considered like this core and foundational society because they sort of evolved into the Inca. So the Inca really emerged in the 1100s and 1200s, and they were started by this guy named Pachacuti. And he basically decided, I'm going to start conquering as much as possible. So they had a tribute system because when you span almost the entire coast of South America, you're going to have some governing issues, right? Oh, yeah, they did use public service. You were right. But they had money like money and goods that were sent up. So I'm counting that as a tribute system. So they had 19,000 miles of road, which is, when we think of roadways, 19,000 miles is a lot. You know, that's how much you can drive in a month in your car. Yes, it's called the Mita system. I did not say that right, unsurprisingly. And they had these irrigation system. Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of their irrigation systems in one of the later slides. So they practiced human sacrifice like the Aztecs, but it was a lot less common. Usually it was like these smaller sacrifices. There's really interesting National Geographic article from like 2000, I think. And it's about these 3 Inca mummies that were found of these children that were actually sacrificed. And it's believed that that's one of the rarest and most holy ceremonies that you could do. Because the child was seen as like pure in their eyes. Anyway, like the Chavin, they were really dependent on maize and potatoes because in the higher elevations, you couldn't really grow a lot. And okay, so here's something that's really interesting about the Inca. They really had to conquer a lot of territory because they had this belief that if you were a ruler, you won't secure your spot in the afterlife unless you conquer more people. Which is really cool. You know, so they kept on conquering more and more land. And like a lot of groups, they had no written language. But they had this different thing that was called the Quipu. Does anyone know what a Quipu is? Well, basically, quipus were like these knotted ropes, and those were their record keeping system. Yeah, it's basically writing. So they would tie these knots in a rope, and they would have a messenger transport it. Because there were no real like there were no real working animals, so they would have a lot of human messengers. But they would carry around all these really complex knotted ropes. I'll write it in the chat if you want to look some pictures up. It's really cool. Oh, I thought I would explain the meme that I put in there. I said Inca nobility when a child is born. Yeah, this is big head time. So basically what that means is that the Incas sort of had this idea, and a lot of these other societies did actually, of head binding. So basically, infants would have their heads like put into some sort of device that would make it like conical or flattened out. It was really prevalent in North America too. And it would sort of be a sign of being closer to the gods. Ooh, wow. It's joke time. It is sort of similar. It's sort of similar to foot binding in China. Good connection. It's joke time, everyone. What's the most popular candy in Cahokia? Anyone know? I've spent way too much time on this. I hope you all know that. Well, it's mounds. Ha ha ha. I'll explain. So basically, Cahokia was this major hub of Mississippian cultures. It's located in Missouri. I don't know how many viewers I have from the United States. I think a lot. But anyway, if you know where St. Louis, I can't talk. I don't know. It's sort of in like the Midwest, but South. And basically, they have these massive like mounds of ground. It's really remarkable. They're huge. And it's believed they were sort of like a religious fixture. And for some reason it was abandoned. I think it was around 1350 for unknown reasons. And it still sort of remains a mystery today. If you're interested, there's a really interesting podcast by Stuff They Don't Want You to Know about the disappearance of Cahokia. They really just abandoned the society in like a day. But anyway, it's kind of weird what the College Board does, because there's so many of these really interesting native groups in the US and Canada, you know, like all the way from the Arctic to the, you know, to the South, but they really don't discuss a lot of them besides like the Mississippian cultures. So, you know, you have like the Athabascans and the Inuit, those are in the north. You have the Iroquois and their confederacy in like the Northeast. You have like all these nomadic groups in the Great Plains. You have the Zuni, the Hopi, the Navajo over in like the Southwest. But for some reason, they only really talk about the Mississippians, which is kind of sad, but they sort of view it as like a core and foundational society. So they view this group as being like a foundation for others. So I made this helpful little slide that sort of summarizes all the continuities that I could find. Feel free to add some of your own, you know, just leave them in the chat if you can think of any other things. So first we have sort of like their social similarities. A lot of, like all these societies, they're really hierarchical. A lot of them are based around religion though, but the hierarchy, I can't talk. You know, it was always like a king, a monarch or a priest at the top. You know, they would have their artisans, their craftspeople. They would have peasants and farmers. Another really cool thing that I found was that they're more equal, I guess you could say. So like the women often have more rights in these societies than they did in Europe. Because at the time in Europe, you know, you had these ideas of, you know, be a sacred womanhood, or you know, they stay in the house, whereas in the Americas really saw them working and having more of a say. And then you also see these really bustling city centers that had up to like over 50,000 people. You know, you have Cusco in the Inca Society, you have Tenochtitlan / Teotihuacan. You have Tikal, you have all these really big cities, and it's kind of crazy to think about. And now we can talk about some of the political similarities. They're all very well, not all of them. A lot of them are very decentralized. You have all the groupings of city-states, and then you have the tributary system with like one overpowering, very strong society. And they're often monarchical, as I mentioned. Usually the religion, they chose a specific person, and the specific person was almost always the son of the previous ruler. And then we also have some environmental interactions. So a lot of these societies, they had these less than optimal situations for food growth. So like you have the Inca, they're all up in the Andes Mountains, so they're really high up, so they really can't grow a lot of food. So you have them creating these really interesting things called waru waru, and basically what that is, it's just like an alternating strip of water and farming. So like you would have water right here, and then you'd have some land here. If you're still confused, think about Minecraft, okay? When you have to farm in Minecraft, you have water, and then you have dirt, and then you have water, and then you have dirt. That's waru waru. And then they also had terrace farming. So they would have like, if this was a mountain, they would have like a terrace here, and they would grow food on this flat surface. They'd have a terrace here, and they would grow food on the flat surface. So that was their terrace farming, and this was really prevalent, especially with like the Chavin culture, and it's still seen today. You know, they're built so well that they still exist. You also see terrace farming a lot in the steppes of Asia. And then you have, you know, the two main foods of a lot of these societies are either maize and or potatoes, which is just really cool because like maize is everywhere. And then you have some of their cultural continuities. And you can see that even in the change in time period, religion is still so important to them. You know, the religion governs their daily life. It changes their architecture. It changes their, you know, their artistry, their artists. I don't know. And then you have a lot of human sacrifice. We saw that in a lot of the South American societies. And it all sort of had this idea of the more people you sacrifice, the more powerful you are. Or it had the idea of, we're going to do this to appease the gods. And you have the ideas of divine rulers. We mentioned that in political and monumental architecture, which I talked about with like the first point. And then we have some economic continuities. The first one is really interregional trade. So you don't have these massive trade routes really spanning until the Inca civilization comes around, because there's so many different terrains within this area of South America and North America that you can't really have a lot of trade routes that connect like the North and South. So it's really interregional trade that we're seeing at this point. And they didn't necessarily have traditional currency. What do I mean by this? They didn't use like a coin or paper money. Where for the Mayans, they used chocolate. Pretty great. I would love for that to be my money. And there was a lot of bartering. In the Incas, you mentioned Mita, which is another really interesting economic system. You also have the tribute system, which I didn't mention here. And then you have technology. So you have like these really complex roadway systems. You know, think of the Inca. They had 19,000 miles of roads. It hurts my brain to think about how much that is. And you also have these roadways sprouting up by the Mayas and the Aztecs in their respective locations. No written languages. That's a really common thing you're seeing. They don't necessarily record them. I think it's only the Mayans that had one, but don't take my word for it on that one. But they found their way around having no written language like the Quipus. And you see these really complex and advanced forms of architecture. Like if I'm going to go back a few slides, we can see in the bottom left corner, we can see Chichen Itza. So this is a really cool temple that was made by the Mayans. It's a series of temples that they're just these step pyramids, and they're very cool and they're very complex architecture, especially for the time. So it's kind of neat how you can see the development of pyramids across different civilizations, like the Egyptians. Another example of the complex architecture is Tenochtitlan. Okay, and now it's time for the Q&A. So if you have questions from class, if you have questions for the slideshow, you want some advice for studying, they are polytheistic. We just got another comment. They are polytheistic. That is a really good point. You don't really see the development of monotheism in a lot of these early American societies. So yeah, if you have any questions from class, if you need to review a topic, unsure about study strategies, then just write your answers and write your questions in the comments. One achievement of the Maya was math. Yeah, that's a really good point. They had a very complex numerical system. They had the number 0. And even if you think about their calendar, that involves math. Yeah, 365 calendar. It's really cool that they were so accurate with it. A lot of their numerical systems were based around like the 60 and base 10, which is pretty neat. Astronomy, wow. You're just naming off some great Mayan contributions. They had like full on observatories in some of the areas. It's very cool. So if you have like need help with your homework, questions from your class, don't know what to do, maybe you're confused by your notes, just write your answers and I can help you out. So there's a question, what kind of DBQs can we expect from this section? That is a very good question. So basically what I would say is you could expect a DBQ really on any of the historical themes. I'll just pull up a picture. Okay, I found a picture from Freemanpedia that summarizes all of these historical thinking skills. I'll just share my screen. Here we can see a list of, that's not historical themes, but that is, so they added a historical theme, technology. So some DBQs you could really expect from this are, you could say, analyze, well, I don't know if it would necessarily be DBQs. I would probably say it's more likely to have an LEQ on this section. But it could say, analyze the continuities and change with in South American societies between, sorry, that's a weird question. I'll just write my answer in the comments. I would probably say, what are some examples of continuity in South American society regarding social structure and religion? So, for example, for that question, you could bring up how like prisoners of war, they were at the bottom of society and used for human sacrifice in like the Aztec societies. Or you could talk about the idea sort of divine right and monarchical descendancy from the heavens. Did that sort of answer your question? Okay, cool. Okay, so then if there's no more questions, oh, okay. Wasn't there a South American civilization that practiced matrilineal? Well, a lot of societies, they were matrilineal, but not necessarily matriarchy. So for those of you who don't know, matrilineal means that you're viewed as descending from the mother's family. So for example, we generally live in a patrilineal society. So like women, when they get married, they take their husband's last name. Whereas in this society, it would be the equivalent of taking your wife's last name. So I believe there were a few, yeah. It's also kind of common, it was common in some of the Western African societies. I think Ghana was also matrilineal. But I wouldn't be surprised. I think there are some. If there aren't any more, I'm just gonna finish the stream off. Okay, just a quick reminder, check me out on Instagram. If you have any questions after the stream, just feel free to ask me. I'll accept your follow and I'll help you out. You can also follow my Twitter. It's Skylar_Walters1. I have some terrible content on there. And also remember to follow Think Fiveable. They have some really helpful reminders of when there are streams, all that cool stuff. Thanks for coming. I had a great time. I hope you guys learned some stuff. Yeah, have a great rest of the week.